Boker Tov, or Erev Tov, for our guest this evening, and I welcome everyone to this morning's Amram Scholar Series. I'm Rabbi Shankman. I'm thrilled to be here with everyone and welcome you to Washington Hebrew Congregation's Amram Scholar Series. The Amram Scholar Series, just to remind everyone, offers a stimulating program of free lectures throughout the year in which world-renowned speakers, authors, scholars, political leaders, policy analysts, and theologians share their perspectives on timely issues or their research into history. The program traces its beginnings to the fall of 1954 when the congregation moved into its Macomb Street home. That fall, participating in a nationwide celebration that marked the 300th anniversary of Jewish settlement in the United States, Washington Hebrew launched what would become this widely recognized Sunday morning lecture program. Today's lecture is being held in partnership with the Jewish Book Council, and we encourage you to purchase the book through our WHC Mitzvah Mall. I'm actually going to add the link in our chat for those who are joining us on the Zoom. If you're not on the Zoom and you're live streaming, you can still access it through the Temple website. And we encourage you to, whether through our Mitzvah Mall, which enables us to do other good deeds in the community, or through a local bookstore, we encourage you to purchase the book, this morning's book, The Unstoppable Startup. And we are delighted to have with us our speaker this morning, Ori Adoni. Just a reminder for those of you, I know we're all experts at Zoom now, but if you want to be able to see everybody, all you need to do is go to the upper right corner of your Zoom where it says view, and you can click on gallery, and that will enable you to see fellow congregants who are joining you. It doesn't enable us to see those of you joining us on the live stream, but we're thrilled that you are joining us as well. So I'm excited to introduce our speaker this morning. I had the opportunity to hear him for about 2 minutes last year at the Jewish Book Council's annual conference, and then also to be in conversation with him last week. Ori Adoni is a general partner at Sonara Capital, a health tech focused fund investing in A and B round companies. He has over 20 years of experience in high tech and over 13 years of being a venture capitalist. Prior to founding Sonara Capital, he was a partner at JVP, Jerusalem Venture Partners, one of Israel's leading venture capitals with an impressive track record of IPOs on NASDAQ and M&As to large leading multinationals. Prior to joining JVP, Ori was CEO of Microsoft Networks, Israel. So as we know, and this is what's been written about his book, more than half of all startups fail, often during the crucial early stages of development when they need to prove their viability on a limited budget. But when it comes to startup success, one country stands out, Israel. Many of us may have read, and I believe we had at Washington Hebrew, the authors of Startup Nation. It is amazing to think about a population of a small country with such a high concentration of startups. And while, as I shared with Ori, this is not really my area of expertise, what's fascinating after reading his book is thinking about those secret ingredients, what goes into successful startups, which can also apply, as we'll talk about later on, other aspects of other industries as well. So Ori, welcome to Washington Hebrew, and looking forward to hearing about why you decided to write this book, The Unstoppable Startup, Mastering Israel's Secret Rules of Chutzpah.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this kind introduction, and thank you for having me. So yeah, it's actually a good segue because you mentioned the high number of startups that actually don't make it. It's close in number to 75% of startups that actually don't make it. And, you know, when people ask me why I wrote this book, so I think there are two main reasons. One is after a certain, you know, amount of years that you spend in tech, you have this experience that you can really try to help these startups, and maybe, you know, if I can improve in 1% their chance to succeed, that would be my humble contribution. And so the book is basically sharing some of my experience, but mainly others' experience, other very successful entrepreneurs that came out of Israel, and they very openly talk about the behind the scenes, and I'll share some of the stories with you in a minute, of what made their startup a success. The other reason was that before COVID, we had like literally hundreds of delegations coming every year from every corner in the world. There's like every corner of the world, all the way from China and India and European countries and Latin America and US and others. And they all kind of asked, you know, Susan, you mentioned this phenomena, how come such a small country has this, you know, Israel is number one with startups per capita in the world, number one in venture capital per capita in the world. We're number 3 in NASDAQ in terms of number of companies. And the first 2 is the United States and China, which are a bit bigger than us. And so everybody's coming to us, you know, what's kind of the secret behind it? And there's quite a few answers to this question, but when kind of you drill down, it's about the ecosystem, and it's about, you know, government support and the army and universities and talent, et cetera, et cetera. But I think that what really differentiates us in Israel is actually the culture. And when you kind of try to pinpoint, and when I did this exercise, I realized that within the culture, this chutzpah that we have, and we'll talk about it in a minute, it's really something that differentiates us. And when I started interviews, all these successful entrepreneurs, and asked them, you know, did chutzpah play a role? And they all had their kind of chutzpah story. And so in a way you say, okay, that there is something there. And by the way, when you look at foreign entrepreneurs, whether they're European or Americans or others, they would also have a chutzpah, but they don't know that it's chutzpah. They don't know how to say it. But the action that they take and the approach that they have is actually full of chutzpah in a way. And so this is kind of was, in a way, the motivation to kind of drill down into this phenomenon. And when you think about chutzpah, there's actually, I would say, a negative side to it and a positive side to it. The negative side is, I would say, being arrogant, being rude in some cases. The way we drive in Israel is not it's not a good sign of chutzpah. So that's kind of the negative side, which I obviously don't support. But the positive side is really interesting, because in order to be a good entrepreneur, you need to have this chutzpah, to be bold and to have this audacity and to come and say, okay, I want to build something that doesn't exist. I want to build something that, you know, better than Microsoft or Google or EMC or any other large multinational. Or I think there is a problem here that nobody addressed, and I can actually not only solve it, but build a company that will be, you know, a global company. And in a way, this is kind of the mindset. And I think that before everything, chutzpah is a mindset, definitely for entrepreneurs. And by the way, it doesn't necessarily have to be high tech, like Susan mentioned, that enables you to challenge the reality, to challenge the status quo, to challenge the solutions as you know it. And I would say that anybody, it doesn't matter if they're tech people or business people or social people or religious people, if they're challenging any kind of status quo, I would say that they need to have some of this chutzpah in order to do that. And so in a way, I try to kind of, I called it rules of chutzpah. I try to put it in a few rules, but as said, I think the first and foremost, the most important thing is this mindset of challenging the existing solutions. One of the great examples is when I interviewed Uri Levin, who was the founder of Waze, which I don't know if you're familiar with it. It's a navigation system. It's like
I think I can speak for probably most people on here are regular users of Waze.
Okay. So I think the story of Waze is really a good example, because when they started Waze at the time, everybody told them, there's no need. There's so many GPSs in the world, and there's Google Maps. Why do you need a navigation system? And actually, they had this concept, and the pain, which Ori told me, he said, the problem with the GPS is that they tell you the shortest way in terms of distance to get to the destination. It doesn't give you the quickest way, the fastest way to get there. And the fastest way is not necessarily the shortest way in terms of the distance, because there are traffic jams. And you know, we all know that you only know at the time about a traffic jam when you were in it, and that's a bit too late because you can't do much about it. So he thought of this idea. He said, I want to have some kind of a community that will share the fact that if somebody is in the jam, they will let the others know that they're in a jam and try another route. And everybody, again, told them that it wouldn't work. First, there are GPSs. Second, people will not share the location. Thirdly, you know, all sorts of rejections. And he and his team thought that, you know, they want to challenge this issue, and the fact that you get stuck in traffic jams and you cannot think in advance or get in advance an alternative route. It's a pain that should be resolved. And so they did. They kind of created ways as some kind of a community that everybody shares their location, and it worked really well. Not only because technology worked, because they actually addressed the pain that nobody else addressed properly. None of the GPS actually addressed this issue. Fast forward a few years, and Google bought them for over $1 billion because they've managed to create these communities and this technology and this platform that actually enabled to solve this pain. So again, it's a good example of an existing situation. And in some cases, you know, you have these entrepreneurs who say, okay, I have pain. Why? I'm sure that there's a solution for that. And then you start searching and there's no solution. And this is in many cases where startups actually start. Another example for that that I think is interesting is a company called Cyactive. And it's a company that addressed the kind of the antivirus space or market. And the way the antivirus worked is that you have a virus, which is usually created by, you know, countries or a lot of I don't know, large companies or whatever. But then the hackers just change something within this virus. So 97% of the viruses are actually mutations of existing viruses. They're not new. They're not written from scratch. And so, you know, talking about COVID, and so it's a mutation. Now, what this, the way this market worked was that the antivirus companies used to kind of signature the new viruses, and then you create an antivirus, and everybody who is signatured cannot pass through their system. But if you change something, it's not signatured anymore, and then it can actually go through. And it was like a cat and mouse kind of thing, but where the hackers just need to do a little something and they're already bypassing the antivirus. And what Cyactive did was a very smart kind of approach. They said, you know what, instead of the companies, the antivirus running after the hackers and after every mutation that they create, let's create the software, a very smart kind of algorithm that will automatically create these mutations. And then we will have tens of thousands of mutations, and we could then create this kind of a blocker that blocks things that don't yet even exist. So they kind of turned the pyramid on its head to some extent. And it was such a brilliant idea that, like, I think from inception of the company, it went less than 18 months. It was purchased by PayPal. And it was a very, very quick exit. But the idea here is not just the exit, it's about this challenging a market saying, okay, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense that the antivirus companies spend so much money and so much effort, and the hackers just in a matter of a few hours of work, they create a new mutation and they bypass it. And so they come up with this idea. So I think that, as I said, any entrepreneurship or any kind of new approach, you need this chutzpah, because again, Cyactiv had the chutzpah to come and say, you know what, you're not looking, you should look at this whole market from a different angle. And they're like, 4 people that were in Be'er Sheva. I said, all right, we're going to revolutionize the antivirus. And they did, because they were, had this chutzpah, the audacity to actually come up and not just challenging, but also come with a great solution. So this is, again, it's just another example of kind of looking at the reality of the status quo and challenging it in an interesting manner.
Can I just ask you one question?
Sure. But by the way, feel free, everybody. Feel free. Thanks.
In your example about Cyactiv, one of the things that you talked about is that that was a great example of the initial idea not staying the same, and the idea of substantial changes based on bringing it out in and you talked a bit about the Israeli Innovation Authority, which I thought is so fascinating, that there is an Israeli Innovation Authority in the Department of the Economy, I believe. But will you share a little bit about that and that impact?
Sure. I think it's a great example how a government can be involved in a positive way in innovation and high-tech industry. What the Israeli government acknowledged, actually quite 30 years ago or so, is that there are stages of companies that are just too risky for the private market to invest in. So angel investors or VCs, venture capitalists, they wouldn't invest because it's too risky. It's too early, or it's too bold, or whatever the reason is, it's too risky, and thus they will not invest in. So the Innovation Authority created a few programs. One of the programs, for example, it's called the Incubation Program. And what it means is that there are 20 licenses, franchises, so to speak, that the government licensed to the private sector. We have one, for example, here in Sana'a. And what it means is that for every company that goes through this incubator, usually a seed stage or pre-seed, very early stage companies, there is a $700,000 investment, of which 85% will be paid by the government, and only 15%, 1/5, will be invested by the incubator. But the equity, the whole 700, will go to the incubator. And so it's a kind of a risk-free loan. If the company doesn't make it, nobody has to pay back anything. If the company does make it, in the future, 3% of the revenues kind of go to royalties until they pay back this risk-free loan, so to speak. So in a way, the authority, and they have a budget of quite a few hundreds of millions of dollars every year to spend on innovation. And so in a way, the Innovation Authority, or the state for that matter, takes the risk and investing the capital coming from the government in order to enable new innovation, risky innovation, to support the new entrepreneurs and not necessarily just the experienced ones. And it's a great vehicle because it enables actually to create these new innovations. Just to give you an idea, for every dollar in this incubation program, for every government dollar, there are, I think, $7 coming from the private market when you look at eventually at the company, because they fundraise from other VCs and other investors. So it's a great investment also from a kind of a country perspective, because it creates jobs, taxes. Eventually, if there's an exit, so there's also a very nice return in terms of taxes. So it really is a win-win between the government and the private sector.
And there's another interesting aspect of the Israeli government vis-a-vis startups and this idea of chutzpah. Will you share a little bit with us about your Army service and how the time in the IDF shaped your work today, and sort of that whole idea of how, how that experience, which is, universal for the most part within Israel, has led to this this sense of empowerment and ability to improvise among those who are involved in startups?
Sure. So I think when you talk about the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, and there are two elements. So first, there are these technological units, which some of you have heard of, A200 or 81, very, very high level, probably the leading in the world in terms of both offensive and defensive cyber technologies. And very, very smart people are working in this in these units. So this is one aspect that actually creates talent to the high-tech sector. But what I think is even more interesting is actually related to the culture of the IDF. And I wasn't a technologist in the Army. I was a commander of a combat unit for quite a few years. And the way you are being trained in the Israeli Army is, usually you would think, armies are about following orders, and which is true, but to a certain extent in Israel. So in Israel, the only thing that matters is are three words: complete the mission. This is it. This is what the whole Israeli army is based on. And what it means is that you are trained to improvise, and you're allowed and you're requested to solve any issues that come in the battlefield and in combat. And you can change the plan and you can do whatever it takes as long as you complete the mission. This is the only thing that matters. And when you're being trained, this is how you are being trained to. So if there's like, I don't know, 3, 4, 5 days drill, you prepare, and there's plans and there's maps, and you go from here and you here, and then, I don't know, 3, 4 hours into the first day of the drill, you start getting all these kind of unexpected events, and say, okay, you were supposed to do this at night, but there's some issues of weather, you have to do it at daytime. Now, what do? Solve it. You thought you had this kind of ammunition, now you don't. What do? You were supposed to get some kind of a backup from the Air Force, and now the Air Force said, whatever, they cannot come. What do? And you cannot just say, I don't do it, or the mission is canceled. No, the mission is not, and you are in charge, and you need to complete the mission, and you can improvise, and you can do whatever it takes in order to complete this mission. And when you take this mission completion mindset into a startup, it's a very powerful mindset, because you are very, very focused on a mission or on a target, and you would do anything to do it. And it can be on the level of an engineer that needs to complete, the code by, I don't know, in 24 hours or by the next week, and they would work the weekends, they would do anything needed in order to complete the mission, or, go to the market and complete the sales, or do anything that, or, fundraise or whatever, but it's a very kind of mission completion mindset. And many of the entrepreneurs are coming with this mindset after they have been served in the army, whether it's the technological units or the combat units. And you can actually see it. They're very targeted, very passionate, very focused, and very mission oriented.
Thank you. Another question is about going back to the idea of chutzpah, which is certainly at the heart of your book. Could you share a little bit with us about, you mentioned the US and China, and there are other nations. You talk about the idea of multinationals. How do you teach chutzpah to non-Israelis? Certainly there's elements of that in Jewish culture, but then how do you teach it outside? And you talk a bit about how noting that charisma and chutzpah are different. So I know that they send, and certainly coming from certain nations with a little bit less of an ability or a cultural norm of questioning, where it's a little bit more that you follow what is set up by the society. Tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. So I think, as you mentioned, I think charisma, it's not something that you can teach. You're either born with it or not, probably. Chutzpah, I think, could be taught because it's some of it is just practice, or it's a mindset that if you get this mindset, you actually can create it or implement it. There are cultures where, for example, it's very uncommon to challenge authority. You wouldn't find, a Japanese saying something to their CEO or their manager, you're wrong, or I think differently. It's very, very rare. It's a very hierarchy kind of culture. And if you've been in these kind of meetings, usually there is even a structure on who's talking when. And it's like very, very structured. And obviously there's some kind of respect you give to the manager. But it's not only in Eastern countries. So I had an interesting story with actually an American CEO that we hired to one of our companies. And it took us a while. It took us like, I don't know, a few months to find the right CEO and to hire him. And the company had actually a team in Israel and a team in the US. And the US were Americans and in Israel was Israelis. And he called me like, I don't know, 2-3 weeks into his new role. And he said, I'm not sure I'm fit to this job. And I said, I was worried. I said, what happened, John? Why are you saying that? And he said, when I tell my US team to do something, and they just go and do it. And when I tell my Israeli team to do it, they start arguing with me. And they said, no, we have a better idea. And we could do this and we can do this. And why are you looking? And he was like, he was like shocked in a way. And I told him, you know what? Before you quit or do anything like that, let's take a month and try to work with that. Try to listen to what they're saying. Try to encourage them to come with ideas. Don't expect them just to follow your orders, but let them actually express their thoughts and their creativity. And let's talk after a month. And then he did that. And then he came back and he said, this is amazing. This is the best thing that ever happened to me. This is so cool. The best ideas came from, an engineer or a sales representative, the people who would never even be consulted with in a way. And he said, this is from now on, this is the way I'm going to work. I'm going to ask the people what they think. I'm going to I tell them, maybe I won't even tell them what I think to start with. But even if I do, again, the Israelis don't mind saying, you're wrong. They don't have any problem with that. They have this chutzpah saying, I think I have a better idea. I think I can develop something that can work better than where your thinking is. And again, it's not necessarily that they're right in every case, but I think this open dialogue and this open creative dialogue, I would say, is what makes startups good, because you constantly having these new ideas, and it's not just the management or the board that, I sit on boards. If I have an idea, I think it's a good idea, otherwise I wouldn't have brought it up. But I would expect people to say why they think it's not a good idea, not why it's a good idea. I think it's a good idea, that's why. But if you think it's not, again, let's challenge that or challenge the idea. And I think that, you mentioned Judaism in a way, I think that it's rooted within our culture all the way from, Abraham that argued with God about Sodom and Gomorrah, and Moses that argued with God, and all the way to the Cheder in a few hundreds years back, where people actually argued and said, okay, I think this rabbi is wrong, or I have a better explanation to this kind of story or this sentence. And I think this challenging culture could be taught. So, you know, again, it's a process, or it's a building a different kind of dialogue. But I think that when you have that, and by the way, again, I saw place, you know, European countries, some of them are very, very conservative, and what I was quite surprised to see is when you come up with this concept and you tell them, you know, and it's not a big thing. You just all right, let's let everybody talk, or you have this solution. Let's try to challenge that. What can we do in order to come up with a better solution? Once you get the people to this mindset, they love it because it's much more creative. It's much more fun. And this is where sometimes great ideas coming from, and not just from, you know, one single CEO that think they have all the brains. It's usually not the case.
One of the really great examples you talk about in your book about sort of going outside the usual suspects is really talking about thinking about certain places, Tel Aviv, Silicon Valley, as those places where that you would automatically assume. But can you share a little bit about the phenomenon of Jerusalem and Beersheba? You mentioned Abraham before. Abraham eventually goes to Beersheba. Can you talk about that, the
Sure.
ability to try someplace new and what is possible? And
Sure.
also, sorry, and also to bring into that, there is a little piece you referenced about Beersheba and Washington, D.C., and thinking about if we bring it back to us in Washington, D.C., that might be interesting to talk about that aspect as well.
Yeah, sure. So I think that, you know, when you talk about ecosystems, whether, you know, large ecosystems like the Silicon Valley or New York or Boston or Tel Aviv for that matter, you usually have, like, I would say 6 main pillars that will kind of compile this ecosystem. And usually they would have talent, you would have funding, or I would say various stages of funding, multinationals, some kind of presence of multinationals, government support that we mentioned earlier, and academia. And to wrap it all up, it's this culture that we're talking about. So usually you would have it concentrated in one place. Now, smaller places that don't necessarily have, you know, all these pillars in place, in some cases need to be much more focused and choose kind of a certain vertical and say, okay, we cannot do everything in everything. We want to be the best place for this. And I don't know how many of you know Beersheba. Beersheba is a relative, it's kind of not a big city in the south of Israel, in the desert, that kind of, I think, probably one of the last things that you would say about Beersheba, you know, 10 years ago was high tech. It was like you would think about camels before you would think about anything else. And because there are a lot of Bedouins there and a lot of camels, it's not just a perception, it's actually right. Now, what's happened there there's a very active and very good mayor to Beersheba. And at JBP at the time, we thought that it could be an interesting thing to see whether or not there could be created kind of a mini ecosystem around a certain theme. And there was the University of Ben-Gurion, of Beersheba, Ben-Gurion University. There were a few multinationals like EMC and Deutsche Telekom. There were a few of them already present in Beersheba. There were, again, the government funding through an incubator that we created there. And the idea was to take a certain vertical and say, okay, the city of Beersheba will be the best at this. And we were thinking, what is this should be? And after analyzing a few potential kind of sub-markets or verticals, we eventually decided the cybersecurity could be a great space to build this ecosystem there. Because of the relationship to these units that I talked about earlier that are moving to the south, because the multinationals, because of the university that had one of the first program in cybersecurity. So you had this talent, funding, multinational, you had this mini ecosystem. And Beersheba indeed became this Cyactiv that I told you earlier about. It's a company that started in Beersheba and was one of the first exits that we had there, and was a very successful. And what happened was that PayPal actually came to Beersheba because this is where the company was. So it's even in a strange way, it's created even kind of a Zionism, if you want, to bring multinationals to open their Israeli presence in the peripheral area of Beersheba, and not necessarily just in Tel Aviv or Herzliya. So I think in that perspective, coming back to Washington, and I did this exercise, and actually I had the opportunity to consult a few places in the US. I think that should Washington, and it is in a way, would want to be kind of a vibrant tech hub, it can probably not compete directly with the Silicon Valley or New York in terms of the, multi-vertical kind of ecosystem. But there are different things that you have in Washington, whether it's the government and whether, the political aspect, the regulation aspect. There's a lot of things that are actually happening in Washington, and you can say, okay, how can we leverage this, and what kind of verticals? And again, cybersecurity can be of relevance as well, or homeland security can be of relevance. So there are all sorts of verticals. You can say, actually, I can be the best in the country, or even the best in the world, the go-to location for this startup, because they have this ecosystem that I need. They have the experts, they have the talent, they have the connections, they have the multinationals, they have the right eyes looking at this ecosystem. So in that perspective, I think that, I don't think we can call Washington a periphery, but tech-wise, it is. So, it's not Boston or New York or the Valley, but it can definitely, I think, flourish as an ecosystem if it will kind of differentiate itself in the right way and leverage its competitive advantages versus other locations or states or cities in the US.
Thank you. There's a question in the chat, and first it's from Dr. Claudia Katka, and who says, thank you for being here. And she says, I've argued that healthcare commodity requires different culture of code of conduct as opposed to any other commodity when looking at venture launch and market penetration, et cetera. How does the Israel platform and sector participants handle that, if so? And how do you approach this distinction in your approach?
So on healthcare, it's a good question, and if I understand correctly, it is definitely different. In some cases, definitely, if you look, for example, on the Israeli healthcare system versus the US healthcare system, it's very, very different. We have HMOs and everybody's insured and it's covered by the government, and the US is completely different. And one of the challenges that we have definitely with healthcare related companies is how to penetrate the US market. And in many cases, you need the FDA approval. Or in Europe, you need the CE approval. And so I think the understanding what the target market you're going to is one thing, but also what we do is have some local people that help us. So, for example, in our fund, we have like an advisory board, like a very large one of, 100 or more key opinion leaders, and many of them are in the US. So if we have whatever a stroke-related company, and we want to see what's the right way to go in the US, and what's the reimbursement codes, and what are the different strategic players, and who are the payers, and who are the the hospitals or the givers, the caregivers. So it's very different, and it's very different from country to country, and it's a challenge. But again, having said that, we do have quite a few companies that had the chutzpah to say, you know what, I think I understand the American market, and I can actually build a product that will help this what's not being solved yet. And again, I can give examples, but the idea of understanding what the market is and understanding what the healthcare system is. You must know that, and you must really understand it well. And in that perspective, by the way, you do have to be humble and make sure that to tell yourself that you probably don't know a lot, and you need to learn, and you need to consult, and you need to talk to local people in order to assist you, because otherwise you will probably crash against the wall, because it's so different in some cases. So it's a very true comment.
One of the things that you reiterate throughout your book is the idea of having those conversations, and to be able to synthesize information and feedback from many different sources, and also be willing to not just stick to the original plan, which is so interesting, especially given the amount of time, energy, and finances. Any examples that you want to share about whether companies, startups that have been notably good at sort of being able to pivot? You mentioned COVID before. I think that COVID has taught us all how to pivot, but that's certainly already built into this culture and into what you're talking about.
Yeah, I think a nice example would be a company called CyberArk, which started as a company that said, you know what, we'll create some kind of a digital vault that if an organization have some, secret documents and very sensitive data or something like that, they can put it in this digital vault. And they came out with it, and they sold a little bit of the software to a few banks and a few players, but it didn't really kind of pick up. It didn't scale. And one of the things that they got from the market as kind of a feedback, say, you know what, yeah, it's nice to have a vault, but we have a much deeper problem, which is the access to the data in the organization. And so they kind of changed their model and said, you know what, we will create this, what we call the privileged access platform that will enable one engineer to access this kind of data and another engineer to access another data, or salesperson, or anybody from the organization. Now, sometimes you need also luck in this business, and their luck in that case was with a guy called Snowden, because what happened was that he had access to everything, and it was suddenly very apparent that it's crazy to give any person in the organization the access to all the data of the organization. So because it became so big, they became very big. We IPO'd them at the time, and it was a very successful IPO in Nasdaq. I think now they're worth probably around $6 or $7 billion. And but the idea of listening to the market, and usually I would say that it doesn't necessarily have to be a complete pivot and to change the whole thing, but the first hypothesis of the company would usually not be 100% accurate. So one of the things we talk to our companies to do is what we call the product market fit. All right, you had an idea. Now, does the market really want it the way you thought it would be? And this dialogue with the market is extremely important, because you can have a great technology, but if it wouldn't fit the market, it wouldn't help. It wouldn't be sufficient. So I think that any good company would have this kind of dialogue with the market, and the market will kind of adjust accordingly. And sometimes, sometimes you say, okay, I had this idea, but it doesn't work, but the technology can serve another purpose. So, for example, again, a company called Thetaray that did a very, very strong, what we call anomaly detection platform. So they know how to take from, hundreds of millions of data points. They can tell, okay, there's an anomaly here, an anomaly here. They started at healthcare, and they couldn't really find the right application. And they changed. They had the same technology, but they focused on the fintech, on the financial and the banks, and say, okay, if I find anomalies in the banking system, that can, and this is actually what happened. They found, anti-money laundering and ATM frauds and things like that that the banks couldn't find, suddenly their software could find. So sometimes you even don't have to change the technology, you just change the application or your go-to-market strategy. And with a very, very small changes, you can actually implement the same technology to different markets, and thus, from a very mediocre business-wise company, you can become an amazing company business-wise.
Thank you. I'm curious, we spoke about a little bit about this the other day, not just to a different market, but perhaps a different industry. Thinking about, I shared with you as I was reading your book that that certainly a lot of these rules and the guidelines that you lay out can apply to other industries and professions as well. I did share with you, I thought it was fascinating thinking about how some of what you speak about applies to synagogue life and what we do within the Jewish community. So I'm curious if you've had those conversations with others and not just about synagogue life, but I'm happy to certainly welcome your thoughts about that. But other ways that what are sort of the rules of thumb, certainly with regards to chutzpah, that that can be used in other areas and other professions and cultures as well.
Yeah, I think that probably the main question that should be asked is why. This is how one of the answers you get very frequently is that this is how we've been doing this for years. And then why? Okay, this you have been done this, but is there really a reason, or hasn't things have changed or evolved or developed that it's time to change? And I think a lot of people don't feel comfortable with change, or they don't feel comfortable with kind of moving targets, so to speak. But I think that inevitably everything needs to be changed and everything needs to be evolved. And Charles Darwin at the time sometimes he's misquote to saying that the fittest is the one who are surviving. And actually what he said is the ones who can adapt to change are the one who survives. These are the species that survive, the only ones. If you don't adapt to change, whether it's climate change, predator change, whatever, and then you come up with a shield, or you come up with a long tongue, or you come up with whatever, these are the species that actually survive. And I think that whether it's a company, could be a multinational, there over 50% of the 500 Fortune from the last 20 years have disappeared. Not just went from 500 to 600, they disappear. We know, Blockbusters or Kodak, or these kind of companies, they just didn't adopt to change at the right time. And I think that in that perspective, that is true to anyone. So, I'm not sure that a synagogue will be closed, but, the congregation can be much smaller if you don't answer the need. And the needs, I think, are changing, and the culture is changing, and the environment is changing, and the competition is changing. The competition doesn't necessarily have to be another synagogue. It could be Netflix, for whatever, Sunday school or any other thing. So I think that being very open and being very direct with yourself, saying, okay, something is not working, or these things are going to a certain direction, we should address that in a certain manner. I think this is something that needs to be done probably in any synagogue or in any school. And I think in synagogues, it's a bit more challenging because the root is very conservative. We have even conservative as a stream. So, and people saying, this is how these things being done. And so, but if you look at actually even Judaism, it has evolved in so many ways throughout the years. Some have been some took it to a very more extreme way, some took it to a much more liberal way, but it has been evolving for many years. So I think even in a local community, there are definitely things that can be addressed and should be challenged and should be created in a new way. And I think that even though sometimes in the first steps it's hard, because you'll get a rejection, but if you're right, if you have a good concept, I'll give you an example. My late father, he was a gynecologist in Hadassah in Jerusalem, and at the time, as when you had your baby as a woman, you couldn't take the baby to the room. There was this special baby room, like where all the babies would be there, and you could only see your baby. You had to go to this room. It's called tinokia. I don't know what the word in English, from the word tinok. But in the room of the mother, you couldn't bring the baby. And he said, to his team, he said, why is that? Why can't the mother be with the baby? He's, unless there is a medical issue that they need to be under, supervision or anything like that. Why not? It's his mother, and then, to start it, he came with this, it's not a very revolutionizing concept. It's almost a natural thing, but everybody kind of said, no, this is not how it's being done. They should go to this tinokian thing. And then, very quickly afterwards, because it just makes sense, the hospital adopted it, and many other hospitals adopted it. And today it's common practice, obviously, that you have your baby with you. It doesn't have to be in this tinokia thing. So I think that, and this is, again, it's not a technology thing. It's just, in a way, evolving kind of practice that you say, why have we have been doing this for so many years this way? Or isn't it time to change it? And in that perspective, I think that any leader, whether it's a business leader, a spiritual leader, a social leader, has this kind of responsibility to be very sensitive to the changes that are happening and adopt whatever they're leading accordingly.
Thank you. Dr. Katka just added something in the chat again. She said, great point on the matrix change element observation. How would you parse the differentiation between independent and dependent variables in function of time in this context application to various sectors, from synagogue platforms to marketplace ventures?
I'm not sure I followed I just want to make sure that I fully understand the question. What is the independent and dependent variables? So I would say there are variables that are being controlled and not controlled. I don't know if that's the idea, because, for example, again, in a startup, you would say you have control over your team, you have control over your product, you have control over your technology, but you don't have control over the market, you don't have control over the trends, you don't have control over the competition. So in that perspective, it's you have to know what you have control and try to do the best you can within these variables, but and the ones that you don't control, you have to be very sensitive to listen to them, because then you would understand where the market is going. Again, I'm not sure this was a question, but this is what I kind of picked up from it. So sorry, Dr. Claudia, if I didn't answer it.
Dr. Katka, do you jump in? Feel free to jump in and clarify.
Sure.
Sure, of course. Thank you so much for this opportunity. It's really fantastic conversation. I only jumped on this because you mentioned very eloquently about the Darwinian component as it relates to the survival of the fittest, as opposed in function of ability to change. And we know that in various different contexts, from physics to, all the way down to, to the religious platforms and adaptations to marketplace, there are dependent and independent variables as such, meaning there's laws that are very absolute and stable, and yet there's laws or other variables, other laws that do change, or the participants, rather, I should say, they do change. So inevitably, I think this differentiation plays a role, an active presence, ever so presence, in the very different context that we mentioned, and I love to know your input on that. I hope this
Yeah.
clarifies.
No, I think that, again, I think that the independent and dependent variables are they're also changing. So I think that, if you look at, I don't know, the warming, global warming or things like that, that they could be independent variables that are changing and, again, affect, for that matter, the biological ecosystem. But I think that eventually it's coming back a little bit to what I was saying earlier. I think that you need to, I would say I think a good place to start is actually to know what are the variables and what are the independent ones and what are the dependent ones, and where are you in this ecosystem or within this structure, and what variables are could be changed and what couldn't be changed. So you have to also be kind of pragmatic in a way and say, okay, it needs to be in stages or whatever. But so I think in that perspective, I would say that probably the first stage is again, as any startup would start with a good competitive analysis and a good market analysis, where the market is going and what the competition is doing and what are the technologies that could be, could compete with them. Similar thing could be done again in a different environment, like a synagogue, a congregation, or a social community.
Thank you so much. Really a lot of food for thought, certainly for us at Washington Hebrew, for those who are interested in perhaps are already in the industry and in the startup world. And we thank you again so much, Uri, for taking the time to be with us to speak about your book. Once again, The Unstoppable Startup, and the link and sorry, and also when I went to add it, I must have accidentally hit mute. And also for those who are following on the live stream, you can find it on our website. Again, we want to thank Uri Adoni. We thank the Jewish Book Council for providing this opportunity, and excited to see how things continue to change. And I'm looking forward to potentially even picking your brain a little bit and consulting on as we watch the Jewish world change and the Jewish community continue to evolve, as you said so beautifully, as it has since the time of Abraham, and from Beersheba to DC to Jerusalem to Silicon Valley. Wonderful lessons in how to use that chutzpah that is certainly innate to many of us, and to see it in such positive ways as leading to change and to a new reality. So thank you so much.
Thank you. I appreciate it for having me.